welcome to our next panel. I'm Harry Surden. I'm a professor of law at the University of Colorado and also affiliated faculty here at Stanford's Codex Center, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Roland and Susan and Megan and the rest of the Codex crew and also the great program staff, as well as the staff and faculty here at Stanford for hosting this terrific event. So today we're going to take a little different view, I think, on our panel than we heard from the last discussion, both complementary and looking at it from slightly different views. But I want to thank Jennifer for that really interesting view from the point of view of Meta. So our fascinating topic is the metaverse, and in some ways it's premature to be having a discussion about the metaverse. By many accounts, it doesn't exist, or it's in nascent forms, or we don't know where it's going to go. Beyond that, there's not even agreement about what the term metaverse means. As we'll see, some people think it's related to virtual reality or augmented reality. Others associate it with Web 3.0, another term that people don't really know what that means. People link it to different technologies like the blockchain. So we don't really know what the metaverse is, so we're going to talk about that. On the other hand, too early is exactly the right time to have a panel at an academic conference. I think the goal of a university is to think about these things in the early stages and help nudge the future that we want to see. So I think our role as a panel at a university is to be both open-minded and embracing of new ideas and societal changes, and to appreciate them, but at the same time to be skeptical, to demand real evidence where there are claims about technology, about what it can do, or about what it's going to do, or about the future of the metaverse, and also to be critical thinkers, to not just accept visions of society that are handed to us by others, but to also be active participants in shaping the society that we all want together and the values that we want to infuse, not that others are letting us infuse into their vision. So I think that is really important. And then one thing I want to say, I want to be, in this panel, I hope to be humble, because there are those out there in the world, and you'll see this a lot out here, and I'm not referring to anybody in this room, but out there in the world, who confidently tell you what the future is going to hold. And there's a lot of them, they say it very confidently. In this panel, I hope to be humble and admit clearly that we do not know the future, and at the same time encourage you to be skeptical because they don't know the future. No matter how confident they say they know the future, they don't, and I invite you to be open-minded but skeptical. So I think this is a really terrific panel over here because we have the perfect group of being both open-minded and embracing, but also skeptical and critical about the future. We have a terrific panel with deep roots who've been thinking about this for years. They're in various ways involved in different aspects of virtual reality, some of the most important people out there. In the interest of time, I'll only provide short introductions because their biographies are so extensive, but I encourage you to look further in the materials for much longer in extensive biographies. But to my right, in no particular order, is Yugi Han, who is a terrific Stanford PhD student who is studying virtual reality in the communications department and is an expert in virtual reality. To her right is Anya Konevsky, Chief Legal Officer at Linden Labs, which is, no, sorry, did I get that wrong?
VP of Product.
What? Oh, VP of Product. Oh, did they get that wrong on
They're
that?
not a lawyer.
Yeah, oh, they had put that on the website. Okay. VP of Product of Linden Labs.
The VP of Product does everything.
Yeah.
Wow, I've
Yes.
been promoted.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll correct that. VP of Product of Linden Labs, which is a pioneer of Second Life, which is one of the earliest and most successful areas in virtual reality. Needing no introduction is Lawrence Lessig, who is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School. And Larry is one of the founding thinkers in this area whose ideas many years ago still resonate today, and he still continues to think about how to develop the societies that we all want to live in. And last but not least is Bill Tai, who's a really influential venture capitalist who has a long history of thinking and working in this space. So thank you to my terrific panel for joining me. So I'm gonna put the first question out there to Anya, and then I'll open it up to the rest of the panel. What is the metaverse? We've just heard one vision of the metaverse about virtual reality, but we know there's a lot of uncertainty about what that term even means. As I mentioned, it's kind of disconnected. Some people associate it with Web 3.0 and decentralized visions of governance or the economy, or others associate it with alternate reality, and some even say Zoom or any presence-enhancing technologies are the metaverse. So, Anya.
Thank you. The metaverse is a dystopian vision of us embodying 3D living spaces because we have completely ruined the physical world. So there's that. On that note, I think I've ruined the rest of this panel. Yeah. It's interesting to be coming into this conversation about the metaverse and how we will define it and where it exists, because certainly until a few months ago, we did think of the metaverse as a dystopian vision, but it's as fine a name for the vision of the technological future as any, so it's perfectly reasonable to speak about it in a new way. Second Life has been a bit of a pioneer in the metaverse space, about 20 years, I think, early. So it's been interesting to see these conversations coming up again, because a lot of the space is filled with discussion that's very similar to what was happening in 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we're having these conversations again. Certainly new technology enhances what we can do, what we can think about, what we can imagine as possible. And the possibility of the dystopian future as well. I think in 2003, none of us could imagine the privacy concerns that we can imagine today. None of us were thinking about the ramifications of eyeball tracking on the privacy of people. And what we have seen over this time as well is that the only way to build in privacy is really to put it into the business model. So in order for us to talk about a metaverse that actually respects privacy, that actually is concerned with governance in a way that is built in by design, is to also think about the business models that allow for that to happen. Otherwise, there's a constant opposition between the two. But hopefully the metaverse won't entirely be defined by brands or by business models. It will exist because there's a need for it to exist and because it fills a niche and creates opportunity. What we've seen with Second Life, the most kind of important societal things that it has presented is opportunities for community, for open-ended communication, for experimentation, for embodying different experiences, for finding connection with people who would never be next to you in the physical space. And one of the things that we have seen is Second Life really allows for inclusion of communities that report feeling unincluded, that feel marginalized, that are historically marginalized. And one of the ways that this becomes possible is a combination of being able to express what you feel is your true self and privacy. In order to feel comfortable expressing your true self, you have to feel confident that your true self won't accidentally be exposed through an ad that is served to you, that somebody might see, that your preferences are not given away carelessly. How we build the metaverse in an interoperable way is also going to be a fascinating discussion because no company is actually motivated to do so. So it is for society, I think, to push that vision forward. And ultimately, I guess the metaverse is an enhanced digital future that allows for all of us, and more importantly, people who are less fortunate than us, to connect in meaningful ways, and that allows access for all of those people to connect in meaningful ways. And I'm pretty sure it's not the blockchain that will make that the most exciting thing. The blockchain may be a tool that serves well in this goal, but ultimately, the most immersive part of ourselves is our brain. So whatever helps our brains immerse into experiences and connect in an open-ended way will hopefully be the metaverse.
Let me throw this out to the rest of the panel. Thank you, Anna. That was really perceptive. Any reactions on what the metaverse is?
I think we should just draw one clear line about this question, which was really muddy and underdeveloped in the talk we saw. Who owns it? I mean, the defining feature of the internet was that the protocols were free. Nobody controlled, nobody could direct, nobody made decisions about who could be included or not. It wasn't a platform where AT&T got to decide whether voice over IP was allowed. It was end-to-end. It preserved neutrality of innovation. And that is the most obvious first question. And what was striking about the presentation about what the metaverse will be is it was as if that was not even yet considered a question. It was a quote unquote, what we will allow the protocols to be. That's to say that it's not anything like what we've seen in the past for the internet. It's like IBM developing the internet. Imagine the internet if IBM had owned it. That's what we're talking about. And I think that's the first division line we should be insisting on and asking and insisting. If there's going to be an interesting thing called the metaverse, it should not be any such thing that a company, a dominant company, and not a very well-behaved dominant company, should be allowed to define the terms of.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then we're going to explore that in a future question. I think it's a great point, which is, should we build the metaverse, or should be the metaverse built for us, and by who? That's a great question. Bill.
You know, my view is that we're actually already all in the metaverse every day already. You know, so actually, if you think about, for example, the use of Zoom, and what is a metaverse? A metaverse, in one definition, is the digital abstraction of yourself and assets in a microeconomy where there's some sort of, transaction. And if you think about Zoom today, it is basically taking your digital self, carrying it into a world where you can come on as a lawyer cat, and anybody else can too. So you're already kind of abstracting yourself and coming into a world of micro communities on the fly, depending on which community of interest you want to be part of. And I do want to pay tribute to Linden Lab and Second Life. And so how many of you have read the book Snow Crash? Okay, so in the 90s, a good snowboard buddy of mine walked up to me. He was CTO of Real Networks, and he said, "Hey, Bill, I'm going to build Snow Crash in real life." And that became Second Life. And so in around 2003, so when initially you would come onto this thing, build like a digital presence, and you had nothing to do because it was unstructured. So Philip Rosedale, the founder, and I had a conversation. I said, "Hey, Philip, we got to give people something to do." And that became the Linden Dollar. So an economy was created, and suddenly there was this robust activity of people doing the same things they did in real life in the unstructured world of the 1800s Wild West banking era, Ponzi schemes, high interest banks were set up, all kinds of crazy stuff was happening. And that led, I think, to the world we're in today, where we literally already have a world of digital microeconomies where, and there's going to be a break point here, there's going to be a flood. We're already using cryptocurrencies in segmented worlds where there's a community of interest. In the same way, like if you think about the creation of colonies, when people got off the boat and they stepped onto land in North America and drew a line around a forest and said, "This is New York, this is Virginia," every single one of them had their own currency. So there's a value transaction layer among any community of interest that is now abstracting itself into any of the vertical communities of different kinds of cryptocurrencies or kind of point programs like Roblox. So, and I don't know how many millions or tens of millions of kids are growing up every day used to transacting value in digital assets with is that fake currency? Is that a point program? I don't know what you call it, but a kind of an abstraction of value in those ecosystems. They're growing up with that every day. And I think that's opening up a potential change in the way value is handled by all of society. The US dollar, as we know it today, and the dominance of a single currency is an aberration. If you think about the history of humans for 400, 500,000 years, we never had anything like that. You had micro communities that traded interest, value tokens, stones, pebbles. Read The Ascent of Money by Neil Ferguson. The modern dollar as we know it, the gold standard only existed for 28 years. And then the petrodollar has been in place for like 40 or 50. But before that, there was never really a totally dominating currency. Yeah, you hear about the British pound, but it was only Western civilization. So I think the freedom that digital gives us is breaking apart the last vestiges of the Industrial Revolution, where machines and the productivity that you would get by storing oil, and therefore the petrodollar, because nations would store their economic future by hoarding oil in the form of paper representing that oil, which is the petrodollar. That whole model is disappearing, because if you think about productivity today, if I gave everyone in this room the choice to give up your phone and electricity or oil, you would choose to keep your phone. So all marginal productivity in the world today is defined by electrons. And that's why I think we're moving into this new world of distributed digital currencies that are defined by communities of interest.
So just to summarize some themes we're hearing here, and some are, I think, more positive, and some are, maybe some would disagree about whether they're positive visions of the metaverse. But on the positive side, I'm hearing control over identity, allowing people to express themselves in different ways, and that seems to be an important theme, in maybe in enhancing people who don't have the comfort to share aspects of themselves in person, having that freedom. Sounds good. Ways of increasing presence and connectivity when in person is not possible. And I think Zoom showed us, we're all tired of Zoom meetings, of course, but I think it would not have been the same experience just on conference calls. So I think Zoom brought some elements of presence. On the other hand, we're hearing, I heard positive words like enhancing values, but I also heard extraction of values and out there. So maybe this is a future of positive, decoupled from oil, or maybe some would say a less centralized view. Yugi, did you have any comments?
I was going to quickly provide my own definition of the metaverse.
Sure.
So my interpretation of the metaverse is that it's one giant reality where it becomes an extension of the internet, and your digital and your physical self become one in a way. But I think, not to muddy the definition of the metaverse even further, but one discrepancy that does arise is the difference between the internet or other social media platforms that might exist is that those realities are created for the user. So each user gets their own reality. A lot of the content that we see is tailored for each person. So the ads that we see, the videos that we see, the images that we interact with are tailored to us. But the metaverse, I think, as a concept, is a reality that everyone shares. So I think then, how do we unify a reality, but at the same time make sure that each reality is tailored to each user? So I think that's one discrepancy. I think that might muddy that definition a bit more, but. Yeah.
And do you have thoughts or concerns about the metaverse seeming like it's one shared universe, but in reality, the way Twitter feeds or Facebook feeds are, or even Google searches, seem like it's the world, but is in fact tailored towards you, and we don't know any better?
I wouldn't say know any better, but one conceptualization of the metaverse that I've heard is using portals to connect different worlds together. But one thing that I think creators haven't thought of is, okay, so for example, if different worlds have different avatars, what happens if, let's say, I go from being a lawyer cat to being like a rock, or like being like a tomato soup? You know what I mean? Like, there are things like, yeah, sure, you can express yourself, but that also has a huge implication on the way you perceive yourself and the way that you live your life outside of the metaverse as well.
Yeah, great point. So shifting, I'm going to direct that next question to Larry, and you've already touched on this a little bit, but I know you've spent a lot of time in your career studying about how to build the communities and societies that we want to live in, that are, just and democratic. So let me throw this out to you. Does it matter if how the metaverse is developed, top down by private companies, bottom up through communities, and also I'll throw in, what are some principles that you've learned in your research that we can create the metaverse that we want?
Yeah, of course it does matter, but I don't think the top-down, bottom-up is the distinction. It's a little bit of a homecoming for me to come back here. I first came here 20 years ago, and I was selling the idea that we should understand that something has become a slogan, code is law. But the first book that I wrote was trying to focus people's attention on the fundamental role of architecture or code in defining the experience we were then having on the internet. And my panic was people weren't focused on the contingency built into that code. So that if we architected the space differently, we could have radically different values. We were celebrating the internet as if the values we had in 1998 and 1999 were guaranteed. But the argument I was making was that actually the values could be radically different depending on how the technology developed. Instead of a technology supporting free speech, it could suppress free speech. Instead of a technology supporting privacy, it could be a technology destroying privacy. And we needed to focus and understand code if we were going to understand how to build the environment we wanted. Now, it was a little bit hysterical. It sounds a little hysterical now, but it was a little hysterical. The New York Times called me a digital Cassandra, that I imagined that the internet would become a space where people would be surveilled perpetually. It was a kind of crazy thought they imagined. But 20 years later, this feels like deja vu all over again. But now I don't want to emphasize code as the thing we need to obsess about. I want to emphasize business model as the thing we need to obsess about. And as if the first slogan was code is law, I think we need to see that business models eat law. Business models eat law. And that's because we've seen how business models of digital technology companies have extraordinary externalities for our society. Like, ordinarily, you don't worry about the externalities of small businesses as they go about, as long as it's not pollution or something, it might change the pattern of interaction in a neighborhood, so what? But the business models of the platforms that dominate this part of the world, and therefore the whole world, have had enormous externalities on our capacity to even govern ourselves. It's not just about the environment, as if the word just could be in that sentence. It's not just about the environment. It's about the capacity to govern that is destroyed by a business model whose core metric or core dynamic is engagement through the extraction of information about individuals. We've got to obsess about the business model. So when you ask, how do we think about how we're going to build a business model? The first question we need to be asking of people like representatives from the place called Meta is, what is the business model? What is the business model? Because, this place that used to be called Facebook, you might have remembered that company, had all of the good things that Jennifer described Meta will have. It had a privacy concern, it had a safety concern, it had a diversity concern, it had a lot of great people working in those areas. Really, really great people. I mean that genuinely. People who really wanted to make that platform beautiful in all of those respects. And they were crushed, all of them, by a business model that had a different objective. And the Facebook files reveal again and again how genuine, honest engineers inside of that company were saying, you need to do this and you need to do that to protect safety or to protect privacy. And it was like, thank you very much. No, we're going to do this because it maximizes engagement, despite the effect on teen girls or despite the effect on democracy. So the question we need to put at the center is, when we're talking about building what will certainly be our future, a future, let's look at our kids, a future where they spend extraordinary amounts of time engaging in a virtual space. There's no doubt it will be, I hope it's not as weird as that vision of it looks like, but there's no doubt it will be something like that. The real choice we can make is whether it will be something like that driven by the business model of today, or something like that driven by very different business models that don't destroy the capacity of us to act as people together in running a society or running a democracy. There is a choice right now. I think your point is exactly right, Harry. We are at the moment where we ought to be asking that question. And it is exactly as you said, Anya, a question about which business model will be driving this. And I fear, it's astonishing, that question was never even addressed, never even teed up in our presentation about what Meta will be.
Great. Thank you, Larry. Let me throw this question out to the rest of the panel. Bill, you look like you have some things to say.
No, I totally agree. I think, well, I guess as Larry was talking, I was wondering myself about what are the implications of what we call Web 3. Because, as you look at the Web 2 model, think of,
would you just tell me how you think about Web 3, just so the
yeah,
folks
I think of it as sort of the encapsulation of the content. One piece of it is the encapsulation of the content that the advertisers throw out at the user. So if you think about the Facebook model of gathering all your content to stick a piece of content that they create for an advertiser, and then they try to count views and hope they're right, and they may or may not be accurate, but they'll report something. And as you introduce the concept of blockchains as a supporting technology, not the main thing, and the tokenization of the content in Web 3 as opposed to Web 2, where it's a little bit squishy, like who's looking at what, there can be a way to take that attention, tokenize it, and directly give it to a person so you can count and know. So I'll give you an example of a project I'm working on with related to Zoom, where there's a name, gigaverse.com. Nothing's on that site yet, but think of Gigaverse as a set of metaverses where there might be specific types of content. And there might be a brand advertiser that's interested in that specific type of content and the audience around a very specific type of content. And when somebody comes to view it, instead of putting a banner ad or something up for people to look at, the attendee gets a token. And so they receive something that looks like a loyalty point. You know who it was, you know what they have, because the blockchain allows the instantiation of smart contracts and other functions on that token. That might be, like a token from Vans shoes, where you can drop it into the website and get a 5% discount. So there's a much more direct relationship where you know who the person is, you know whether they engaged or not, and you don't have this kind of randomness that appears, that is part of the Web 2 world. But it's only one piece of it. So I was just sitting there thinking as he's talking about, well, when you go really direct and know who's engaging and can really count and identify, maybe there's going to be a need for even better controls. But I think there is a way to kind of control that more. And so now control, I don't know what that means. I'm not a control freak, and but I think you wouldn't want an IBM kind of thing there. But I think there's going to need to be more rules that are for kind of for goodness, not badness, and the data is going to be there to allow tighter visibility, more granular visibility into your audience and what they're doing. And I think like right now you can't really always tell, and Meta can tell you whatever they want, and what you have no argument. But now you'll have real data.
Yeah, this is a great point, and I just want to summarize some of the things that but some of the points I'm hearing here, which are really interesting. Well, first, I'd love at some point to hear whether you think that's a good future where you can do micro-identification or not, and you could see it going either ways. But I just want to...
just quickly, I think technology is one of those things where it can be used for good or bad.
Yeah.
And you have to be just cognizant of it as you're doing, because what does technology do? It lowers friction to things, makes them very replicable and highly scalable, so it can get away from you really quickly. So you've got to kind of be aware of it as you're building it.
Great. And I'll just throw it over to Anya, please.
I have to say that sounded a little bit dystopian and scary. I think we are, as a technological society, completely addicted to data. We are so used to being able to get the most minute data about anybody who interacts with our products, whether it is relevant to their interaction with our products or not, at any time. That as long as we continue building ways for us to gather that data, no amount of regulation that is always 10 years too late will be able to catch up to it. So there has to be something built into the design of our systems that actually doesn't allow us to get it. Users will give away their privacy. Ultimately, people say they care about their privacy, and then they will accept all your cookies, and then they will give away their mother's maiden name for a 5% off coupon to Vans, right? So we can't just assume that giving people control but incentivizing them to give it away is going to be an effective measure of building just societies. And what we've seen already, with, say, elections, is that it is very difficult to sway public opinion with the data that we have gathered, advertently or inadvertently. I mean, I fully believe that the Cambridge Analytica outcome was not intentional from Meta. It is just that it was fully made possible by the technology that was there. So as we design for the future, I think it is a centralized government responsibility to put in limits to the amount of data that companies are able to gather. And the more we expect to regulate it later, the more we'll fail at it.
Can I just say, so I'd be happy with that. But I want to make clear that we're talking about two different kinds of solutions. One kind of solution is to say, let's accept the business model, the extractive surveillance capitalism business model, but just limit their ability to do it. Regulate the amount of data they can get. That's one solution, and certainly we'd be in a better world today if we had that than we have right now. But an alternative is to say we ought to be thinking about whether the surveillance capitalism business model is appropriate in certain spaces. Now, what's striking about that is that it's been framed as a binary, like we either have it or we don't. And I think there's a lot of spaces on the continuum there. Like, should we have surveillance capitalism on the news feed? Or in contexts where people are engaging about issues about public import, as opposed to Nike shoes. I'm happy to not have people advertise mountain climbing stuff to me. That makes me happy, because I'm not going to climb mountains. It's just not going to happen. So the surveillance capitalism in that context, I think, has fewer externalities than it does when it's leading people to believe that the election was stolen and there's clear evidence of the election being stolen.
How do you separate that, though, if it turns out that the best predictor of whether you need climbing shoes is your political affiliation?
Yeah.
So these are some really good points, some themes I want to summarize here. So one idea, it sounds like people on this panel have accepted the future that largely the metaverse is going to come from the private sector, although I don't think it inherently has to be that way, but it's probably likely that it's going to go that way. And I think Larry rightly brings up the idea we need to interrogate the business model. The current, as it's called, surveillance capital model, where data, privately identified data is captured by companies and then monetized, is sort of just an artifact of the way the laws were back in 1995. But I want to advance the idea that it doesn't have to be that way. We can build the society that we want, and we can change laws and regulate behavior. So we don't have to live in the world of default rules and artifacts. Maybe that's a good model, but we don't have to just passively accept it. Moving on, I'm going to throw this question out to Bill. So we've heard one view of the metaverse. We'll all be living in an virtual alternate reality world a significant portion of the time. But we could imagine different ways this could play out. The metaverse could be a niche product, although somewhat large niche product. So we see things like, we've heard Roblox mentioned, or Fortnite, or Pokemon Go. There are a lot of people, millions of people that use them, but it's not so much so that we need, the law of Roblox, or we need to be thinking about that. So one way it could go is sort of a tool that's embedded, and we use it occasionally, or a niche tool that, like Fortnite, that people are involved in, or it could be this all-encompassing vision of society where we interact. I don't think we know, but I'll throw this out to Bill. Does it matter whether the metaverse is, the Snow Crash version, or the Ready Player Go version, or this sort of, sometimes we put this on for an hour, play a couple games, and
I see that the world is sort of a whole bunch of different simultaneous metaverses where you can opt in and go into any one you want, whatever you want. Right, so I think an early proxy for that, back to the prior Meta and Facebook, is if you think about Facebook groups. Okay, so a long time ago, you were sort of geographically limited. Before the internet, you know, the neighborhood you grew up in, those were your friends, that was your club, that was your social circle. You were kind of like geographically limited. But once you overlaid a digital fabric where you could connect to anyone else, anywhere, communities of interest would spring up. So Facebook groups were kind of like, you know, I as a kiteboarder could connect to people all over the world in this sort of abstracted layer that wasn't a metaverse per se, but, you know, I touched people all over the world and I wasn't geographically constrained. So I think as we go forward, those kinds of things are going to start to take on a little bit more meat. And you can enter communities of interest where any person, and you could be a member of a lot, you know, cooking, kiteboarding, cycle, whatever it is, you know, you could be a member of multiple overlapping groups at any time where the granularity of yourself could be expressed anywhere you want it to be. And I think that's where we're headed, where a lot of them are going to exist, and it's kind of, you know, hopefully just opt in and not, you know, kind of forced. And maybe there's no surveillance in some, and there's a little surveillance in others because there's like a special shoe group and you want to buy like, you know, digital shoes or whatever it is. You know, so I think it's going to look like that.
Any other thoughts about this? You know, different, whether it matters if the metaverse becomes, you know, one of the slogans I'll throw out is just because they build it doesn't mean society will come, right? It could be a large thing, it could be a small thing, so.
Certainly, I think it matters in terms of the law, because if it is and continues to be a niche thing, the law kind of doesn't care, right? The law begins to care when it's a thing that touches everybody, or if there's an application that applies across many metaverses in some way. And if it is niche, as, say, Second Life has been largely, all of these concepts we talk about in the metaverse, they exist in Second Life. It's all there, except for Bitcoin, maybe. But you could pay for things in Bitcoin anyway. The reason that, you know, the U.S. Congress isn't concerned with legislating Second Life as such is because it has remained a niche product, and existing laws that apply to other companies, while some concepts have been tested along the way, right, there's not like a Second Life law that is being hotly debated. If there are many niches and they each have their own governance systems and problems, they will be tested with existing laws. But if it becomes an all-encompassing situation, then certainly law steps in pretty quickly.
That's exactly right. But here's the difference, right? Law should have stepped in, 10 years ago in the dominant platform development that we saw, and it didn't. And it didn't, not for accidental reasons. You know, it wasn't. I mean, there's a lot of political economy and influence that stopped law from stepping in. There were decisions made not to step in. And it led to this world where we have right now of extraordinary influence of a relatively small number. So you're exactly right. The law should be thinking about how it steps in once this becomes something more than the niche. And if you're right, Bill, that it's lots of these different places where we get to opt in and opt out, it's not the thing to fear. The thing to fear is if it becomes the dominant default platform that you must participate in to do everything from going to school or to being at work or to meeting up with your friends or to connecting with your grandmother. I mean, if it becomes Facebook 2.0, and that is the defining existence, then the fact that there is no law, I think, means it's a very scary prospect.
I would like to.
Sure.
I would also like to add that, yes, the metaverse is a space, but one other thing that has been bleeding into our society, I think, is people. So one thing is virtual influencers and avatars. We already see them in places outside of the metaverse. So one thing that I've been questioning is avatars playing as a second or a degree separated individual. So we also see, for example, corporations and businesses taking on the form of avatars and influencing our lives. So I think we should also look not only at oh, what is going to be the future of the metaverse, and is it a niche, but also what components of the metaverse are already in our lives already, and how are they influencing the way we live, and how might that inform the laws that will ultimately be created if that is a thing.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And we've heard this theme now from several folks on the panel that we're seeing elements of the future metaverse already in our lives. We have digital native kids who are used to spending a lot of time on the screen and interacting with digital items. So there are elements that are certainly going to be there in the future that we need to be aware of. I wanted to highlight one interesting tension between the three of you, which was, if the metaverse starts out as a niche product, the law might ignore it because it's only Roblox, right? And then it's only maybe too late when the negative externalities, which are, the bad effects on society or the environment or the world that a business model has, it might be too late at that point because of influence or strength or the problems it's causing. So that's sort of an interesting tension that I think we're right here at the beginning we need to be thinking about from the outset. Yugi, let me ask you this question. We're going to be humble, as I said, as we peer to the future, but this is FutureLaw, so of course we're going to peer into the future, but humbly. So let me ask you, where do you see the metaverse going? What do you see its influences on society in the near term, in whatever vision you think of it?
So I think a lot of people are compelled by the immersion and presence aspect of the metaverse. We are excited by embodiment, the ability to take on new avatars. And I think that's exciting, but there's a lot of psychological implications on both your digital self and your offline self that we aren't really considering. We're just excited by it, but we're not actually thinking about the repercussions of it. So one thing that our research lab does is look at, okay, so for example, if we take on a body that is black, and if you're not black, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? If you are a male identifying person and you take on the body of a female identifying person, what are the long-term effects of that? So there's this idea that my advisor, who's the director of the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, came up with, along with Nikki, which is the Proteus effect, which is this idea that the embodiment, the way you embody an avatar and the way it looks like and the way it behaves will affect your offline and online behavior in a long-term way. So the pro-social acts that you engage in, the way you perceive yourself, the way you have implicit biases about other people, the more confidence you might have, like all these things are going to bleed into our digital and offline self. So that's one thing that we should consider. And there's this also excitement in presence. And I think a lot of educators, people who are interested in using it for training, people who are interested in using it for different applications are excited by the idea of immersion and presence. But one thing we haven't looked at is how does that change across time? So for example, and I'm going to bring in the example of the smartboard that was introduced to a lot of classrooms. I don't know if people were in school at that time or if this is an older generation. But when I was in school, we had the smartboard, and that kind of didn't work out just because it was a really cool thing, but a lot of instructors didn't know how to use it. And over time, it just sort of dusted away in the corner. So there is this fear of the metaverse sort of potentially becoming that thing where everyone's really excited, but anyone who's familiar with the history of VR knows that VR has existed for 50 years already. And this might just be another wave where it might come and go. So the question is, how does VR use hold over time? And that's one thing that we're studying in the lab. So will the novelty wear off, and will presence and the allure of presence wear off as well? Or do we become more comfortable, and will that presence become stronger psychologically? So that's one question that we've also been thinking about, along with embodiment. Then there's also one thing that I don't think we're considering, and I don't know why, but we're physically limited by nausea. The amount of time you can spend in VR is 30 minutes. So this idea of oh, let's spend hours in here, let's wake up in this world is not really a thing. So that's something that I think we should consider when designing for experiences in VR. So not everything has to be in VR, or not everything has to be in the metaverse. If it can be done outside, and if it can be done better outside, then why do we have to emphasize it? Why do we have to like say it has to be in VR is the question. So yeah, thinking about how do we design for that unique 30 minutes that we can leverage VR has to be a question of importance.
I really like that point of view. And one comment that you made is, companies are really bad at predicting the future, but they do it confidently all the time. So we don't know whether this will be just another thing that a company says is the future that turns out not to be, although it could be or it could look very different. One follow-up question I have for you. Does your lab, have you thought about the addictive qualities of the metaverse? Because I know that a lot of the phone and gaming platforms are deliberately designed to keep people's attention because of the business model, and this is a problem.
So it's not my area of research, but my colleague Cyan has looked into basically communities that exist on platforms like VRChat. So why certain people are attracted and what kind of groups form on platforms like that, and why people spend more of their time there than they do in the physical world. So that is one realm of research that is going on, but it should definitely be approached with caution, just so we don't view them or view this population as like this strange group of people that exists, but it's going to be inevitably, I think, the reality that we're aspiring for.
Great, thank you.
I want to chime in on that, because I think what you're describing about presence and embodiment and communities, it's already happening in some very weird ways. So if you think about what Twitter is today, I don't know how many of you have seen like people putting these what's called a PFP or an NFT up as their profile picture, but so the presence and embodiment that people feel around the NFT that they chose to represent them, it's kind of that, and there's sort of a brand association that goes with which one you put up there. And the Twitter, which, it seems to be evolving to this thing where it's kind of like dialogue and lots of, chatter and hate and all kinds of stuff in certain communities that keeps people engaged, so it's like a set of metaverses already where you're coming in as an NFT, and every NFT collection is sort of its own metaverse. It's very fascinating where that whole thing is going to go.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it comes back to some degree again to Larry's point about negative externalities of the business model. Twitter has evolved because hate and controversy gets people agitated and addicted and coming back for more, but that's not necessarily good for society. Larry, did you have thoughts about this?
Well, I think that what's wonderful about the work you're talking about is the need to go deep in understanding the psychological effects. But I think we need to think about the psychological effects over time and over generations. So one reality about gaming, for example, is when you're 13 or 14 or 15 and you shouldn't be, but you can spend 7 or 8 or 9 hours, playing shooter games or whatever, you develop a skill. And when you're 35, you can't afford to do that. But when those kids turn 35, they're going to still want to be engaging in a certain way. And then the question is, in what way can they engage if they can't have the skills that they develop by spending 7 or 8 hours a day? So then the world of engagement that will continue to feed these psychological dynamics that you're talking about will be different. It'll be a different kind of mode of play. And it could be a healthier mode of play. Like the way of engaging might not be as potentially destructive. I don't mean just because it's a shooter game, but also because it's triggering the worst kind of psychological effects. But we will only understand that if this work that you're describing is supported and flourished and able to be a real external check on what we are discovering as we see people living in these different generations of that experience.
Anya, did you have any thoughts?
I do think that generations that grow up with particular technologies and interaction models become more skeptical of them as they grow up, right? I think the kids who grew up gaming and encountered the more addictive models are actually likely more resistant to them as they grow up as adults. So there's some aspect of, this is why the industry is evolving to be, more and more captivating and addictive is because the old models of engagement are no longer working. Again, like when Second Life was starting out, there was some amount of moral panic about the addictiveness of this immersive virtual world. But then now we're actually looking back at it kind of sentimentally and going, wasn't that a nice and fair business model? Think about how reasonable a fee-based economy is in light of what it has evolved to be. So not only is what's happening today in the world of gaming, in kind of the engagement models that are being built by the private sector, going to be ineffective in the future, we're going to be highly incentivized to make it even more addictive later on. And I have no positive vision of how to improve on that. I think hopefully, humans will continue to evolve to become skeptical of the current addictive models, and then companies will develop new ones.
Well, it sounds like at least some of the consensus is closely interrogating the business models of the metaverse to make sure that we have more positive outcomes, like some of the presence enhancing and identity enhancing aspects, and fewer of the dystopian concerns that we're hearing quite a bit about. In terms of maybe the more positive aspect, let me throw this out to the entire panel. So a lot of what we do here at Stanford's Codex Center is computational law, which more or less is embodying law in code in various ways to help make things more efficient, access to justice. There is at least the possibility or the hope that maybe some of the benefits of code as law practices can help enhance the various aspects of the metaverse. Let me throw that out to the panel to see what you think. Larry, do you have thoughts as a originator of the idea?
Well, it's a little bit awkward because I just said that that was a great idea 20 years ago, and now I want to talk about what you were just talking about, which is business model here. So yeah, obviously, we need to think about the way that code is protecting values we think of as important. So I think Anya's point again about how to architect to guarantee certain dimensions of privacy is a really critical point. I just want to emphasize it's never going to be enough. It's never going to be enough. If there is a free rein to adopt the most profitable in the context of the surveillance capital model, it's never going to be enough. So let's recognize that, and it doesn't mean stop thinking about the interaction. It's just recognize you need more than just that as your focus.
And I'm sorry, I just want to follow up with that. So when you say it's not enough, you mean maybe laws in code enhancing from values and also external modes of regulation to foster those values as well?
Yeah, so like when I was obsessing about code as law, I was really obsessing about the way the law needs to encourage the code to be the kind of code that protects values we think of as important: free speech and privacy and the opportunity to innovate. So end-to-end is what we used to call it, but it's now network neutrality. Like those are ways to think about the interaction between code and law that produces an environment that we would celebrate. And the failure to think about that has resulted in code evolving to produce dystopian realities. Facebook newsfeed is an example. So here too, the point is to think about how the law interacts with code, and law also interacts with business models. So you will see in Europe the law much more aggressively trying to channel business models related to advertising and the newsfeed type exchanges, because they begin to recognize it's a bad thing to allow that business model to live in a public discourse space without banishing it, without saying we should eliminate advertising. And we need to begin to develop this non-binary way of thinking, because if it's binary, obviously we're not going to give up the internet, we're not going to give up advertising. Okay, fine. But then if it's non-binary, we can begin to think about how do we channel it or narrow it or control it, thinking not just about how do we control code, but also how we think about controlling business model.
Thanks. Anya.
I actually wanted to touch back on something Bill brought up about the ownership of your attention, right? So what happens today in the business model, right, is that your attention is actually owned by the product that you're consuming. So figuring out models that embody in code the user's ownership of their attention and their own ability to monetize it. I don't know how. But I think there's a key there to a more equitable model that allows capitalism to flourish without destroying all boundaries of privacy. It used to be, right, that on the internet nobody knew that you're a dog, and now everybody knows that you're a dog. Everything about you is known. So how do we give you back the control to be different things in different places on the internet, and still allow all of those places to be successful?
Bill, did you?
You know, access. So anytime people want to present a problem to solve, my head starts spinning. So the dog, if the dog is in the creator economy and is influential, he can own his own attention, because I think the way you do that is you would basically have a token that represents the dog that accrues value when the creator dog goes to visit things, as opposed to the platform owning it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I could see how a person, there is value in the attention for sure. So the question is, how do you draw the lines to demarcate that and allow the person to own it? And it is possible that you just have a digital wallet, and if your attention is valuable, because some people's attention is more valuable than other people's attention to advertisers, because they can spend, right? So the relative value of that person projected to a brand advertiser would make some want to give that person more. And so I think an economic transaction model, it is possible to do that. So maybe we'll build
Yeah.
that into Gigaverse. Who knows?
Well, I'd like to hear this positive view, because what I'm hearing, the surveillance economy that we have, where companies buy and sell data without control of the users, as I believe is a default artifact of the way the law and technology was. But you're saying maybe innovations in technology can change those defaults to start re-architecting into a more positive surveillance, non-surveillance economy where we have a little control.
Yeah, I think the Web 2 and Web 3, Web 2, the viewer existed outside of the system, right? It's kind of like trying to measure the eyeballs, but because you can now digitally encapsulate both the attention and the person, they're sort of digitally and economically trackable and attached. So yeah, that's dystopian, but if you write the rules the right way, you can form an economic flow to the node.
That's a great way. Anya, I'm sorry, did you want to?
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, so we're going to open it up just for a few audience questions in the last couple of minutes. I think somebody in the back had their hand up first. Yeah. Oh, it's Pablo.
Can you make taught my con law class 20 years ago, so I'm going to try to flip this on you. Let's say in the state of, let's say Vermont, there's a political sense that this is a very terrible thing. This VR is going to just ruin humanity. It's a transition state to the extinction of species into some digital format. It's bad for health. It's bad for everything. And damn it, not in Vermont. Is there a constitutional right to go into the metaverse?
I'm sorry, the last word, to go into the what?
I say metaverse, but I know that
Oh, is there a constitutional right? No, there's not a constitutional right to engage with a particular economic platform. There's a constitutional right to speak. There's a constitutional right to engage in political activity. But the worst thing that could happen in trying to figure out how to make this thing work well is to allow the constitutional lawyers to enter the conversation. Literally 10 years ago, some of the people I respect the most in First Amendment law were hired by Google to write papers that demonstrated that any effort to regulate the Google algorithm violated the First Amendment. Why? Because James Madison, when he crafted the First Amendment, was thinking, let's make sure that the computer algorithm that Google has in 200 years is free of any government regulation. So now the presumption among constitutional lawyers is there's nothing that can be done to regulate the platforms because that's regulating speech. So I would love just to have that question in some way pushed to the side until we get an idea of how to make this a healthy environment, because we just have no clue about how to do that right now.
That's a great. We do not want metaverse originalism, I'm hearing. Yes, in the red.
Hi. So it's interesting because other countries are able to do this, right? And so a lot of these companies, right, relied on Section 230 for a long time. So what about change? What do you think about, changing that? Because obviously, unless we can pierce the corporate veil and come after them
I would think that the fact that the companies are global is what allows other countries to do this, right? So even if there's not a willingness in the US to legislate, the fact that the companies are global allows the EU to legislate it, which goes back to the question of, does it matter whether it's niche or global? It matters, because once it's global, any of the governments that have a sizable enough population using the product are then able to legislate the product.
Yeah, but with 230, yes, there needs to be 230 reform. But let's recognize we have a completely broken and dysfunctional Congress. There's just no capacity to imagine them doing anything sensible in this space at all. So, right, true. But there will be regulation in other parts of the world. And I think our best hope is that to the extent other parts of the world regulate in a smart way, and we can see the consequences for democratic speech or the capacity to run sane elections and things like that, then maybe that will begin to teach us what we should be doing too. But I wouldn't expect you're going to see it happen inside of Washington right now.
All right, one more question over there. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you so much for this panel and the stark contrast that we saw. So my question is about given that we have new kinds of business models, how do you think about dispute resolution and alternative dispute resolution in the metaverse?
So when I answer this question, usually people think it's just because I'm a law professor. So I'm going to say, don't think it's just because I'm a law professor, but I will say, I think ADR is terrible, but I think the law is worse. So the legal system sucks. It is really deeply broken in 1,000 ways. It's too expensive, it's too slow, it can't give people justice. It doesn't give people justice, which is why we get to ADR, which is why we begin to innovate in all sorts of ADR-like places. But the ADR that we produce doesn't have any of the ideals or virtues that the law is supposed to have. It's not transparent or public. We don't know the reasons why somebody won or lost. We don't know the corrupting relationship between the corporations that hire the representatives and the people who actually do the judgments. We don't know any of that. So we've produced the worst of both possible worlds. We have a terrible legal system, and we have a terrible private legal system. And so, I would think we should try to get a good legal system, whether public or private, but we just are nowhere close to that now.
Well, I'll offer, thank you. And I'll offer maybe a more hopeful vision is, I think some of the things that people are trying to build is a future where we have fairer aspects, and that's what we should try and build, fairer virtual or electronic means of resolving disputes that embody the values that we hold high. So I'll put that as a challenge to all of us to do that. Well, we're at time here, but I want to thank this terrific panel for a fascinating discussion that was a little this topic, but also hopeful, I think.
Yeah, so do you see Philip at all?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, tell him I said hi, or
Thank you,
I'll
Harry,
vice
for
versa.
running a terrific session. I feel Larry just made the case for computational law. So thank you for that, too.